orthodox approaches to development often make implementing adaptive leadership approaches difficult. We asked leaders in development to discuss the barriers to adaptive leadership and to suggest some strategies to overcome them.
I think one of the big challenges that we face in development is that the reporting instruments, the accounting tools that we use to monitor the flow of money, the way in which we track who has done what, where, with whom, all of those different techniques, all those tools that we use are all designed to, or brought into development to, in a world in which we were primarily trying to build infrastructure, or we were trying to solve technical problems of one kind or another in central banks or in ministries of finance. And so the history of development, sort of, and certainly in its early decades, laid down DNA, as it were, that was very much centered around reporting instruments that were built around logistics of one kind or technical reform of one kind. And so the challenge we face is that we're still left with that legacy, but in the 21st century now find ourselves dealing with much more complex and complicated problems and much more contentious problems, ones that just can't be mapped into an Excel spreadsheet and with a clear sense that if you put X amount of resources into a system, you'll get Y amounts of predictable outcomes happening at the end. No one knows what the most effective way to run a government is. No one knows what the most effective way to end a civil war is. No one knows how to deal with ethnic violence or religious extremism. All of these things are problems that are very much front and centre in development at the moment, but the infrastructure, the tools that we have to deal with all of those things are products of a very different time.
I think that one of the biggest barriers to adaptive leadership is people who have preset ideas about how they think things should be, people who are bringing their own values and their own stories to the table but don't necessarily have a lot of flexibility to work with other people's stories and other people's values. It's a big challenge, but I think that one of the most important ways that as an individual you can counter that is by really working on your internal advocacy skills. So you really need to find ways that you can influence other people's ways of thinking and other people's ways of seeing the challenge at hand. And I think that that's something that maybe we don't talk about enough. You need to be really good at that internal advocacy for certain ways of working. Working on your communication skills is a really good way to offset that as well. You need to be able to tell the story about why a certain way of working is effective and really help people to see that vision of what you're trying to achieve. So a big part of working in campaigns is that you need to be reactive to external things that are happening all the time. You know, if the government makes an announcement or if there's a media story that picks up, then you need to be able to respond to it in a really meaningful way. It's just the reality that that's where you get the most influencing happening, is when something is on the news cycle or when the government has done something that is remarkable, for better or for worse. The challenge with that is that there are so many stakeholders within the organisation who have an idea of what their work looks like in this space. So it's so critical that from the outset, when you're planning a campaign, there are caveats around the fact that this plan needs to be mobile, that there are external forces shifting all the time, and that it's really critical to be responsive. The other thing that is so important is having really good relationships with the people that you're working with and being able to justify the changes that you're making and justify the fact that being responsive is really critical. And I guess there are always going to be times where you come up at a blocker and where it's difficult to move people because they're so fixed. And that's where I think skills around internal advocacy and storytelling are so important, because you need to be able to sell your vision for what you're trying to change, and you need to really be able to sell your methods for changing that. And I think that is a whole skill set in and of itself, being able to communicate people about why you're working the way that you're working so that they're inspired to work with you in that way as well.
The mental model of aid is the project, and the project has a plan, it has predicted outcomes, it has measurables, and it has quite a short time scale, typically 2 or 3 years. So if you're in an emergent adaptive process which could take 10 years where you can't predict the outcomes, that's a huge problem both for the donors in justifying funding it, but also actually for the NGOs or the people who are being funded, because we find it very hard to think outside the project box. So I think we have to rethink, essentially rethink the role of the project if we're actually going to get serious about adaptive programs. So how do we make that happen? How do we get adaptive programming becoming routine rather than the exception? I think there's a number of things that need to happen. One is we need to work with the people who are funding this. We need to collect examples of good donorship, like the one I mentioned in Tajikistan. We need to find out how that was possible. Was it down to some maverick in the Swiss agency that funded it? Was it because of a country specifics, or what was it that made that possible? I think we have to look at our own staff policies. So are we employing people who are efficient implementers of plans? Because they are not going to be necessarily going to be the kind of people who are imaginative and facilitatory. They may well just want to grind through the plan and ignore reality and what's going on around them. So we probably need to hire different kinds of people, support them in different ways, have more mentoring. I would love it if part of any evaluation of an aid project was, and what did you get wrong and what did you change halfway? Because if you haven't changed anything in the course of your aid project, you probably weren't thinking hard enough. So we need to rethink, I think, the whole structure of design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, learning and reporting, and even before that, the structure of who we employ and how we support them.
One of the big barriers is people who are unable to adapt. So there are personalities and there are professionals who might have worked in the development sector for decades, and they are used to a certain method of working and implementation and program development. When they are faced with challenges and issues where you need to be an adaptive leader, that the main barrier is they're unable to adapt to it. So I think it has to do with resilience and also your personality to face challenges based on the situation at hand, rather than what you think based on your experience needs to happen. So I'll explain this, that the example that I was giving earlier about Zaatari camp, there are a lot of NGOs and a lot of people working there who were just waiting for the situation to improve. Although this was not a waiting game. We knew the crisis was increasing in Syria. We knew the refugee influx was not dying down, and there was no expectation of it happening even in the foreseeable weeks and months. So we needed to adapt rather than wait for the situation to bring back to a normal state. And those who were unable to adapt face the risks and challenges of program failure. You will not be able to achieve any of the results that you've planned for unless you adapt to it.